June 6, 1944. 0:14 hours, 400 feet above the Norman countryside. Number engine. No lights. No sound except the wind screaming past the plywood skin of the glider, and the controlled, deliberate breathing of 180 men who have made their peace with dying. Major John Howard is 28 years old, from the back streets of Kennington in Oxford, and he is holding a piece of cardboard, not a map, not a weapon, not a radio set or a Sten gun. A piece of cardboard roughly the size of a dinner plate, taken from the company office stores 6 months ago by a man who needed something to write on. He had drawn on it himself, in standard issue HB pencil, the full timing matrix of the operation that was about to either win the first hour of D-Day or kill every man in 6 gliders before a single American had set foot on French soil. The cardboard had cost him 4p. That was the whole of it, a piece of cardboard, a pencil, and 4p. The bridge was 2 minutes away. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork was at the controls directly ahead of him in the cockpit, flying blind at 110 miles an hour toward a target the size of a tennis court in total Norman darkness. With no instruments beyond his altimeter, his airspeed indicator, and the timing system that John Howard had devised and written on a piece of 4-penny cardboard and that every commander in 6th Airborne Division above the rank of lieutenant colonel had told him was unnecessary, overcomplicated, and dangerous. Walwork had the card memorized. He didn't need it anymore. But Howard held it anyway. To Howard's Lafitte, 19 years old and rigid with fear he was doing his very best not to show, Private Tommy Parr of Bermondsey pressed his forehead against the fuselage and stared at nothing. His hands were locked around his rifle so tight his knuckles had gone white in the darkness. He had been sick once, quietly, out the side hatch 20 minutes back over the channel. He had not mentioned it. Howard had not mentioned it either. That was their arrangement. "Sir," Tommy said quietly, not looking at Howard. "Still here, Tommy. 2 minutes. 2 minutes." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think the timing's right, the board?" Howard looked at the cardboard in his hands. His timing matrix, his 4-penny solution to the problem that had been killing British soldiers at defended river crossings for 2 years, the grid, the columns, the second-by-second intervals, 47 yards. They had to land within 47 yards. Everything on the board, everything he had built and argued for and been told to abandon, everything his men had rehearsed 437 times in a field in Wiltshire, depended on 47 yards. The official tolerance was 200 yards. His commanding officer had said that 47 yards was a fantasy, had ordered Howard to accept 200 yards and stop the unauthorized night flights, had said, specifically, that the board was creating a false precision that would get men killed. Howard had said, "Yes, sir." And then he had kept the board, and Walwork had kept flying the low approach. And here, 2 minutes from the bridge, was where they found out who had been right. "The timing is right," Howard said. The glider dropped. The story of how one working-class company commander from Kennington, Oxford, changed the first hour of D-Day with a piece of cardboard that cost 4p begins not in the fields of Normandy, but in the printing works off the Abingdon Road, where a man named Albert Howard taught his youngest son that there was only one rule that mattered. Albert Howard was a compositor at the Holywell Press on the Abingdon Road in Oxford, which is not a glamorous occupation, but which in 1919 was steady enough to keep a family of 5 in a terraced house in Kennington, with enough left feet over for a library book or two. He was a quiet man, Albert, not given to speeches or pronouncements. He had been in the Great War with the Ox and Bucks, 2 years in Flanders, 1 on the Somme, and had come back with all 4 limbs and a quietness about him that his children understood was not the absence of feeling, but the deliberate control of it. He had survived by being quiet and by being fast, and he had no desire to explain that in detail to anyone. He explained it to John once. John was 11 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of broken clock that he had been trying to fix for 3 days. He had pulled it apart correctly enough. He could not get it back together. The springs and cogs were laid out in a careful row, and he had been staring at them for the better part of an afternoon when his father came in from the press, smelling of ink and paper. Albert Howard looked at the row of parts. He looked at his son. He pulled out the chair opposite and sat down. "What's the problem?" "Can't work out where the spring goes," John said. "I know it goes somewhere in the middle, but I can't work out the order." Albert Howard looked at the parts for 20 seconds. Then he reached across, picked up the main spring, set it, inserted it into the mechanism, clicked the gear train around it, slid the plate back, and wound the crown. The clock ticked. It had taken him 35 seconds. John stared at it. "How did you—" "First and fast, son," his father said, standing up and pushing in the chair. "First and fast. Everything else follows." He tapped the table once and went through to the kitchen to wash his hands. John Howard would carry those 6 words for the rest of his life. He would hear them at the most unlikely moments. In the middle of a battle, in a training yard in Wiltshire, in a room full of senior officers who were telling him he was wrong. He would hear them at 0 feet, 2 minutes out, above a river in France. First and fast. Everything else follows. He had no idea, sitting at that kitchen table with the ticking clock, that those 6 words would put him at the front of the most precisely executed airborne assault in the history of warfare. Albert Howard died of a chest infection in the winter of 1933, when John was 19, and working as a clerk at the Oxford City Council offices on St. Aldate Street. The infection came on fast, the way chest infections did then, in a city full of factory smoke and river damp. He was dead in a week. The funeral was small, and the grief was large, and John Howard stood at the graveside in the November cold and heard his father's voice saying, "First and fast, son, first and fast." Everything else follows, and understood that the man who had said it was gone, but the words were not. He did not need to be told what to do next. He enlisted. He joined the King's Shropshire Light Infantry as a private soldier in April 1934, age 20. He had no family connections in the officer class, he had no public school education, no university degree, no uncle in the mess. He had his father's hands, his father's quietness, and his father's eyes. The kind of eyes that look at a problem and see the mechanism underneath before they see the surface. The army, to his considerable surprise, noticed. His regimental sergeant major was a Glaswegian named MacDougall, who had the complexion of a man pickled in Scottish weather, and the professional instincts of a man who had been sorting through recruits for 20 years and had learned to spot the good ones in the first 48 hours. MacDougall spotted Howard in 20. He said nothing about it directly. That was not how it was done. What he did was arrange, quietly, for Private Howard to receive access to the regimental library, which contained a set of military history books stretching back to Marlborough. He arranged for Howard to attend a lecture series that was nominally for NCOs. He arranged for Howard to be attached to the intelligence section during exercises, which meant he spent 3 weeks reading enemy order of battle assessments and tactical appreciation documents that a compositor's son from Kennington had no business reading. He never explained why. He never said, "I think you're worth educating." That was not how MacDougall operated. He just quietly opened doors and let Howard walk through them. And if Howard noticed that the doors were being opened specifically for him, he never mentioned it either. Howard devoured the books. He had a mechanical mind. He thought in systems and sequences, in the relationship between moving parts, and military history, it turned out, was almost entirely about systems and sequences. He could see the mechanism underneath. He began to understand, in a way he could not yet articulate, that the difference between operations that worked and operations that failed was almost never a matter of courage. It was almost always a matter of timing, who arrived first, and how fast they moved when they got there. First and fast, son. He was promoted to Lance Corporal in 1936, Corporal in 1939, and Company Sergeant Major in the first year of the war, which was as fast as any man had risen through that regiment without a commission. In the autumn of 1940, with the war 6 months old and every battalion in the Army desperately short of experienced officers, he was put forward for a commission. He was given a temporary appointment as second lieutenant and assigned to the 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Here is what you need to understand about what that meant. In 1940, in the British Army, a man commissioned from the ranks did not simply become an officer in the way that a product of Sandhurst or Oxford became an officer. He became an officer the way a tradesman becomes a member of a club that does not want him. He was present, he was technically qualified, and there existed a ceiling above his head that was politely never acknowledged, but was as solid as reinforced concrete. The mess welcomed him with the courtesy of men who have been well bred enough to make courtesy indistinguishable from indifference. His commanding officer was a man named Lieutenant Colonel Roger Fenwick, who had been to Winchester and Sandhurst and who regarded Howard with the particular careful respect of a man who has encountered something capable that does not fit any category he has been given. Fenwick was not a bad officer. He was not a small man or a stupid one. He was, rather, a product of a system that had spent a century convincing itself that leadership was a quality transmitted through the bloodline of the public schools, rather than the capacity of the individual mind. He said to Howard, at their first interview, "I don't care where a man comes from, Howard. If he can do the job, he can do the job." He believed this. Howard believed he believed it. The ceiling above Howard's head remained exactly where it was. He was given D Company in 1942, 181 men, privates, corporals, sergeants, a handful of junior officers. He had not been given to understand that this was a defeat. He understood it anyway. He had no idea, sitting in the company commander's office for the first time with the autumn rain hitting the Wiltshire windows, that D Company was going to be the instrument of the most important 10 minutes of the war. In the late autumn of 1943, the planning for Operation Overlord required someone to solve a problem that had been killing men since 1940. Here is what you need to understand about that problem, because everything that follows depends on understanding it. A defended bridge is not a military obstacle. It is a death trap. It is a structure that channels every attacking soldier through a killing zone, the open, elevated roadway that the defenders have had years to pre-register with every weapon in their arsenal. A bridge cannot be flanked. It cannot be approached from cover. A man crossing a defended bridge in daylight has approximately the survival odds of a man crossing an open field toward a prepared machine gun position, except that on a bridge there is nowhere to go sideways, nowhere to drop flat, nowhere to find the particular mercy of dead ground. You go forward or you go back, and if the defenders are competent, neither option is survivable. The standard solution in 1943 was to either bypass defended bridges using engineering units to build alternatives, or to attempt flanking operations to clear the defenders before a direct crossing. Both methods took time, and time in an amphibious assault was the one resource that could not be manufactured. The specific bridges were the ones crossing the Caen Canal and the River Orne at Bénouville and Ranville, 5 miles inland from what would become Sword Beach. If those bridges were not in Allied hands by the time the amphibious assault began, the German 21st Panzer Division, sitting 12 miles away with 230 tanks, could drive straight to the beach and cut the landing force in half. Every man hitting Sword Beach, every Royal Marine in the landing Crayfeet, every infantryman climbing the sea wall, all of them depended on those two bridges being captured before the Germans could blow them. The intelligence estimate was unambiguous. If the bridges were blown, the eastern flank of the D-Day landings failed. If the eastern flank failed, the entire operation was at risk. Previous operations had demonstrated what happened when this kind of problem was approached with the standard methods. Howard had studied them with the particular attention of a man who expected to be sent to do something similar. Private Frank Clement had studied them too. Frank was 23 years old, from Salford in Lancashire, the son of a tram driver, and had the slow, careful way of speaking that people from that part of the world have when they are being precise about something that matters. He had been in Howard's company for a year and a half. He could strip and reassemble a Bren gun blindfolded in 45 seconds, which was a thing Howard had seen him do at least a dozen times and never stopped finding impressive. He had a photograph of a girl named Edith in his left feet breast pocket, and he carried it the way soldiers carry photographs, visibly and as a declaration. They were in the planning room in Wiltshire 6 weeks before D-Day, when the intelligence briefing on bridge assault failures arrived from Corps. Howard read it aloud. The Sicily Operations, July 1943. Conventional parachute drops intended to capture 3 bridges before German forces could reach them. 800 men dropped in the wrong locations. None of the bridges captured in time. All 3 blown by German engineers within 4 hours of the drops, while the paratroopers were still assembling in the wrong fields 2 miles away. He stopped reading and set the document down. Frank Clement was sitting 2 chairs to his left, very still. "That's 800 men," Frank said. "Yes, and all 3 bridges blown, yes." Frank looked at the table for a moment. "What happened to the paratroopers who assembled late?" Howard didn't answer immediately. The document answered for him. Of the 800 men dropped, 116 were killed in the subsequent engagements. 48 drowned in the sea before they reached the shore, swept into the water by the inaccuracy of the drops. Of the bridges, all 3 blown. The objectives, none achieved. "You see the problem," Howard said. "I see the problem," Frank said. "The problem is that they went in 2 miles out and tried to walk to the bridge. And by the time they got there, the Germans were already moving." Howard tapped the document. "It's not a problem of courage. It was never a problem of courage. It's a problem of distance and time." He could hear his father's voice somewhere underneath that sentence. "First and fast, son." Frank was quiet for a moment, then, "So we have to go in on top of it within 47 yards. Frank looked at him. "That's not possible at night. Not with standard approach and tolerance procedures," Howard said. "No, it isn't." He had no idea at that moment that 6 weeks later Frank Clement would be the reason he understood with absolute certainty that the 47-yard standard was not just possible but necessary. He did not know then what the next 6 weeks would cost. The planning moved quickly. 6 Horsa gliders, 181 men. 2 bridges. The Horsa was a beautiful aircraft in its way, 100 feet of wing, 48 feet of fuselage, built entirely of wood and fabric. No engine, no weapons, no armor, costing considerably less to build than a Spitfire and considerably more likely to get the men inside it killed on landing. It flew like a bus and landed like a controlled crash, and the gap between controlled and uncontrolled was, at best, a matter of several hundred yards. The official doctrine stated that a night glider landing within 200 yards of a target was an acceptable result. Howard had read the official doctrine and thrown it in the bin. His reasoning was simple. If a glider landed 200 yards from the bridge, the men inside it had 200 yards to cover on foot, in the dark, in enemy-occupied France, before the German sentries heard them coming. And the engineers at the far end of the bridge pressed the detonator on the explosive charges that had been wired to the bridge supports for exactly this contingency. 200 yards at a run took approximately 90 seconds. In 90 seconds, the bridge was gone and every man crossing it was dead. 47 yards. That was the number. At a flat sprint, 47 yards took 11 seconds. 11 seconds was not enough time for a German engineer to reach the detonator, recognize the threat, and press the button. 47 yards was the margin between a bridge and a crater, between success and catastrophe, between the D-Day plan working and the eastern flank of the most complex amphibious operation in history, collapsing before dawn. The problem was that no glider in the Royal Air Force had ever reliably landed within 47 yards of a target at night. Howard took a piece of cardboard from the company office stores, standard squared notepaper, stiffened. He sat down at the table in the planning room with a pencil, and he worked out the timing matrix for the entire operation. From the moment the tow rope released over the Norman coast to the moment the last platoon reached its assigned position on the bridge in 30-second intervals. If wall work released at exactly the right altitude and flew the correct heading and held the correct airspeed for the correct number of seconds, the glider would arrive within 47 yards of the bridge. Not possibly. Not approximately. Exactly. The mathematics worked. Howard had checked them 4 times. He had then taken the cardboard to Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork. Walwork was 25, from Manchester, and was one of those people who convey competence through absolute economy of expression. He read the timing matrix without speaking for approximately 3 minutes. Then he looked up. "You want me to land within 47 yards? I want you to land within 47 yards. Walwork looked at the card again. "The tolerances here, I know what the tolerances are. The official standard, I know what the official standard is." Walwork was quiet for a moment, looking at the card. He was the kind of man who needed to understand a problem fully before he agreed to try to solve it, which was exactly the kind of man Howard wanted flying glider number 91. He turned the card over. He looked at the approach geometry Howard had drawn on the back. "The dive angle," Walwork said. 60 degrees. Final approach, you cut the speed fast and drop hard. Walwork stared at the diagram. "No one's ever done that at night." "No, they haven't. If I misjudge the release point by 100 feet of altitude, we'll land in the river." "Right." Walwork looked at him. "And the card. This is what we're flying to. This is what we're flying to. 440 feet at release, 110 miles per hour on the run-in, 60-degree dive at 2 miles. Wheel contact at 35 seconds from dive initiation, 47 yards. Walwork looked at the timing matrix for a long time. Then he handed it back. "I'll need to practice it," he said. "I know. The extra flights, I've arranged them." He had not, in fact, arranged them. He had not asked for authorization to arrange them. He had simply decided that they were going to happen and worked out what resources he would need to make them happen without anyone in his chain of command finding out, until the results made the argument for him. This was the piece of cardboard. This was the fourpence. The board that encoded a doctrine his commanding officer was about to tell him to abandon. The extra training flights began on a Tuesday in March, using Horsa gliders borrowed from the No. 1 heavy glider conversion unit under a standing training order that Howard signed himself, which was technically within his authority as long as no one examined it too closely. He and Walwork flew the approach profile 17 times in the following 3 weeks. 14 times they landed more than 70 yards from the target marker. Once they came within 39 yards. Twice they came within 60. The board was the problem, not Walwork's flying, not the approach profile. The board. Here is what you need to understand about that. The timing matrix worked on paper. In the air, at night, at 110 miles per hour, the variables behaved differently than theory predicted. Wind dry feet over the channel, temperature differentials affecting airspeed, the specific glide ratio of a loaded Horsa varying in ways the manufacturer's specification didn't fully capture. Howard discovered that the board needed to be adjusted, 3 different corrections for 3 different wind conditions, and that the adjustments needed to be taught to Walwork, not just given to him on paper. This took 6 more flights. Unauthorized. Conducted at night, off the regular training schedule with Walwork and Howard and a ground party of 3 men who understood that what they were doing was technically a court-martial offense and did it anyway, because Howard had explained the mathematics to them, and the mathematics were unanswerable. The board, corrected and revised, was now worth 4 pence and 400 hours of unauthorized flying time. Tommy Parr was there on the 14th flight, which was the first one that nearly killed them. It was a Thursday night in late March. Cold, overcast, no moon, perfect conditions for the approach. Walwork brought the glider in at the correct heading, and Howard was watching the altimeter and calling out the timing when the glider hit a pocket of dead air above the river and dropped 40 feet in 2 seconds. Walwork pulled the nose up, the glider staggered, and they passed the landing zone traveling sideways at 80 miles per hour, and hit the far end of the field with a crunch that split the main undercarriage spar and put the nose into the earth. Nobody was hurt. The glider was unrepairable. Howard and Walwork climbed out of the wreckage and stood in the cold dark for a moment. Then Tommy Parr, who had been in the fuselage holding on to a fuselage rib with both hands, climbed out and stood in front of Howard. His face, even in the dark, was not right. His voice, when he found it, had a quality Howard had heard before in men who had just seen something that had broken through the layer of trained calm. "Sir," Tommy said, we're fine. Walk it off." "Sir, I need to." Tommy stopped. His hands were shaking and he was looking at the wreckage. Danny Walsh was killed in a training crash last October. Chalgrove Airfield. Horsa came down short of the strip and broke apart. Danny was 21. He was from Croydon. I was there, I saw it. And this. He turned away from Howard and put his hands on his knees and breathed for a moment. "This is the same. This is exactly the same." Howard waited. "What are we doing?" Tommy turned back. His voice was cracking along the edges. "Sir, respectfully, what in God's name are we doing out here at midnight in a broken glider? For what? For a piece of cardboard you drew on. We've just put a Horsa into a field in Wiltshire, because you want to land within 47 yards of a bridge in France that we have never seen, and you want to do it at night." Tommy, Danny Walsh was 21 years old, and I held him while he bled out in a field in Chalgrove. "Tommy." Howard's voice was the same as always, quiet, the same as when he was talking about something entirely ordinary. "I know about Danny. I know what happened at Chalgrove. And I know that what happened here was not the same. The glider is in bits, because of wind shear, not because of the approach. The approach was correct. I was watching the altimeter on the run-in. We were exactly on profile until the air pocket. That is not a flaw in the system. That is weather. We correct for weather." Tommy stared at him. "The mathematics work," Howard said. "I have checked them more times than I can count. Walwork has flown the profile correctly, 11 times out of 14. The 3 misses were all correctable variables: wind, aircraft loading, 1 instrument malfunction. The system works. Tonight was weather. And if there's weather on the night," Howard looked at him steadily, "then the boys on the beach die." Tommy was silent for a long time. Somewhere across the field, Walwork was inspecting the undercarriage wreckage with a torch, cataloging the damage with the professional detachment of a man who has broken things for a living. "You're going to carry on," Tommy said finally. "Not a question." "Yes." Tommy looked at the wreckage. He looked at Howard. He looked at the dark sky above Wiltshire, where the stars were hidden in cloud. Then he nodded. Once, slowly, the way men nod when they have decided to accept something they cannot argue their way out of. "I'm with you," he said. "I just needed you to hear that I'm scared." "I heard it," Howard said. "Now let's get the kit out of the fuselage before someone sees the lights." He did not know then that Tommy's honesty that night was the most important thing anyone said to him in the months before D-Day. He did not know that 14 years later, Tommy Parr would be the only living witness who could describe exactly what John Howard had built and what it had cost, and why it had worked when everyone above him in the chain of command had told him to stop. The demonstration happened on a Tuesday in April 1944, 6 weeks before D-Day, in front of Brigadier Nigel Powett of the 5th Parachute Brigade and Lieutenant Colonel Roger Fenwick and 8 other officers who had gathered in the briefing room at Tarrant Rushton Airfield on a grey afternoon that smelled of rain and chalk. Howard stood at the front with the zero board propped against the briefing table and explained the 47-yard requirement in 10 minutes. He explained the timing matrix. He explained the corrected approach profile. He explained that Walwork had demonstrated it 17 times and achieved within 47 yards on 6 of those attempts, and that the trend line showed clear improvement. The laughter started around the 3rd minute. Not loud laughter. Officers' laughter, which is the kind that stays contained behind straight faces while the eyes do the work. It was Major Arthur Pringle of the 225th Field Company who said it aloud, which was the kind of social service that Pringle performed in these situations, so that others didn't have to. 47 yards, Pringle said. "In the dark. Without an engine." "Correct," Howard said. "Based on a timing matrix drawn on—" Pringle looked at the board on the table. "Is that cardboard?" "Yes." "Right." Pringle looked at the ceiling. The eyes around the room performed their function. Brigadier Powett had the face of a man accustomed to absorbing enthusiasm from subordinates and redirecting it toward achievable objectives. He waited for the room to settle. "Howard," Powett said, "what is the official tolerance standard for glider night landings?" 200 yards, sir. "And you're proposing 47? "Yes, sir." "Based on 17 practice flights." 17 documented practice flights, sir. The accuracy rate is improving with each iteration." Powett looked at the board. He looked at Howard. Then he looked at Fenwick, who was sitting to his lee feet with the expression of a man who has known this conversation was coming. "The extra flights," Fenwick said to Howard. "The 17 you've documented. They weren't on the official training schedule." "No, sir." "Who authorized them?" "I did, sir." Fenwick's expression did not change. "You authorized your own training flights. The standing training order allows company commanders to—" "I know what it allows." Fenwick put his pencil down. "You've been running unauthorized night flights, Howard, in Horsa gliders, using training resources that weren't allocated to D Company." Howard said nothing. "And you've done this," Powett said, "because you believe a timing matrix on a piece of cardboard can reliably deliver glider landings within 47 yards of a target in total darkness." "Yes, sir." Powett looked at the cardboard board. He looked at Howard. He looked at the 8 officers in the room whose collective opinion of the piece of cardboard was visible in the particular quality of their silence. "Major Howard," Powett said, "D Company will plan to the standard 200-yard tolerance. You will discontinue the unauthorized training flights. You will accept that within 47 yards is a theoretical target and not an operational planning assumption." He paused. "Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "Destroy the board, if you please." It creates a false precision that will damage your men's confidence if they fail to achieve it under operational conditions. Yes, sir. He carried the board out of the room under his arm. He put it in his kit bag. He wrapped it in a spare shirt and pushed it to the bottom. He went back to the planning room and told Tommy Parr that they were continuing the training. Tommy looked at him. "The board," Tommy said. "Still here." Tommy was quiet for a moment. He looked at the kit bag. He looked at Howard. Then he nodded. "Right," he said. "When's the next flight?" 3 days before Operation Overlord began, Company Sergeant Major Thomas Thornton found Howard in the vehicle park at Tarrant Rushton doing a final kit inspection. Thornton was 41 years old, from Sunderland, and had been in the Army since Howard was in primary school. He had the specific authority of a man who had survived long enough to understand that the official rules and the effective rules were not always the same document. He walked up to Howard and stood beside him looking at the vehicles. Not at Howard. "Sergeant Major," Howard said. "Sir." Thornton was looking at the motor pool. "I trust your kit is in order for the operation." "It is." Thornton was quiet for a moment. His hands were clasped behind his back. He appeared to be studying the wheel alignment of the nearest Jeep. "I was at Tarrant Rushton last autumn," Thornton said, "for the 6th Air Landing Brigade exercises. Saw some of the glider approach training." He paused. Wall work was flying some unusual profiles. Howard said nothing. "Very precise," Thornton said. "Unusual profiles. Very precise." He examined the Jeep's tire. "I recall the Brigadier issued some guidance about approach standards some weeks ago." "He did, and I trust," Thornton said, still looking at the tire, "that D Company has complied fully with that guidance." Howard said nothing. Thornton looked up at the sky for a moment. He appeared to find it satisfactory. He looked back at the tire. Then he said, "Good." He clasped his hands a little more firmly behind his back. "That's important. Compliance. The men trust the chain of command." A pause. "They trust their company commander in particular." He looked at the sky once more. 47 yards, he said, almost inaudibly to no particular audience. Then he turned and walked away without looking back. He did not look at the kit bag on Howard's table. He did not need to. The night before Operation Dead Stick, John Howard wrote 2 letters. The first was to Joy. "My darling Joy, if you are reading this, then I am gone, but before you let yourself be too sad about that, I want you to know that I am not. I am not sad about it. The thing I have been working toward for 2 years is right in front of me, and I have done everything I know how to do to make it work. If it has not worked, the fault is not in the preparation. There is not one more rehearsal I could have run, not one more correction I could have made to the board. If I have not come home, it is because war is not fully controllable no matter how good the mathematics are, and you know better than anyone that I believe in mathematics. I believe in first and fast. I believe in what I have taught these men. I love you in a way I have always been bad at expressing, which I suspect you already know. Tell the children, when they are old enough, that their father was not afraid. That would be the truth. Give my books to anyone who wants them. Keep the photograph on the mantelpiece. You look beautiful in it. Yours always, John." The second letter was to Tommy Parr. He handed it to him in person, standing in the equipment bay at midnight, 6 hours before boarding. Tommy read it in the light of a paraffin lantern. Then he looked up. "Sir, keep it safe," Howard said. "Give it back to me when we're done. If you can't give it back to me, you'll know why I wrote it." Tommy folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket, next to his ammunition. His face had the quality that Howard had come to recognize in the months of training, not the panic he'd heard at the Wiltshire crash, but something quieter, something resolved. "I'll give it back, sir," Tommy said. Howard looked at him for a moment. Tommy Parr was 19 years old, from a terraced house in Bermondsey where his mother, a woman named Ida who worked at the Tate & Lyle factory in Silvertown, had sent her only son off to war with the specific instruction delivered to John Howard personally on the pavement outside their front door, in the rain, 3 months ago, that he was to come home. Ida Parr had been 51 years old, and had the hands of a woman who has worked a factory floor since she was 16, and the eyes of a woman who has been afraid for a very long time and has decided to say the thing that fear usually prevents you from saying. She had taken Howard's hand and held it, and she had said, "Mr. Howard, You bring my boy home. That's all I'm asking. Whatever else happens, bring Tommy home." Howard had looked at Tommy, standing by the gate with his kit bag and his expression of comprehensive mortification. He had looked back at Ida Parr. He had thought about what a promise meant and what it cost, and what it would cost not to make it. "I'll bring him home, Mrs. Parr," he said. "You have my word." She held his hand for a moment longer, 3 seconds. Then she let go and went back into the house and closed the door. And Howard had carried the weight of those 3 seconds across the channel, through the planning meetings and the training flights and the night at Wiltshire when Tommy had been shaking in the dark, and he was carrying it now. At midnight in the equipment bay at Tarrant Rushton, looking at the 19-year-old boy he had promised to bring home. "I'll bring him home, Mrs. Parr. You have my word." He was not certain he could keep it. He was certain he was going to try. The 6 gliders leafied Tarrant Rushton Airfield in tow at 22:56 hours on June 5, 1944, pulled aloft by Halifax bombers through a sky the color of gunmetal. 181 men, 2 bridges, a plan encoded on a piece of cardboard that had cost 4 pence, which was currently in John Howard's leafied breast pocket, alongside his compass, and the letter from Joy, because he had decided to keep it there as a reminder of exactly what he was flying toward and why. They crossed the coast at 23 minutes past midnight, climbing to 6,000 feet to clear the coastal flak batteries that opened up as the formation crossed the shoreline, their tracer visible even through the fuselage, red lines crossing the darkness like stitches in black cloth. Howard could hear the explosions, distant, not close, and he could hear the men around him in the fuselage breathing in the particular careful way that men breathe when they are maintaining composure by main force. Tommy was to his lee feet, very still, both hands locked around his rifle. In the dim interior light, Howard could see his face. Tommy was looking straight ahead at the fuselage wall, and his lips were moving slightly without sound. Whether he was praying or repeating his timing sequence, Howard did not ask. At 42 minutes past midnight, Walwork's voice came back from the cockpit. 2 minutes. The tow rope released with a crack that Howard felt in his sternum. The sound of the Halifax engines fell away, and the silence that replaced it was the most absolute silence John Howard had ever experienced, a silence made more complete by the wind on the fuselage skin, which was not noise, but rather the sound that silence makes at 110 miles an hour. Tommy said, 2 minutes. 2 minutes, Howard said. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the zero board. He looked at it one last time in the darkness. Not because he needed to read it, he had every number memorized, but because it had cost 4 pence, and he had built it against the explicit orders of his brigade commander, and he was about to find out whether a compositor's son from Kennington and a glider pilot from Manchester and a piece of cardboard were right, or whether every man in this aircraft was about to die 100 yards from the bridge because the approach profile was wrong by 2 seconds. He put the board back in his pocket. "Tommy," he said. "Sir, when this glider stops, you know what you do. I know what I do. Tell me." Tommy took a breath. Out the door. Lafitte along the canal bank, 3rd position on the east parapet. 0 + 40 seconds. "Good. Sir, still here. I'm going to give Mrs. Parr's letter back in the morning." Howard looked at him. Tommy was looking straight ahead. Not at Howard, but with the quality of a man who has said the most important thing he knows how to say, and is now waiting for the world to respond. "Yes," Howard said. "You are." The glider dropped, 60 feet above the Caen Canal, inside the guardhouse at the Bénouville Bridge. Corporal Klaus Ehrmann was explaining to Private Heinrich Bauer exactly why they had nothing to worry about. Ehrmann was 27, from Cologne, and had been at the Bénouville Bridge for 11 months. He knew the bridge the way a man knows his own hallway, the loose plank on the west approach, the angle of the lamp on the south tower, the specific groan of the mechanism when the swing bridge was operated. He had made his peace with the posting. The Americans were on the other side of the channel. The Tommies were on the other side of the channel. 11 months, and the worst thing to happen was a cow getting onto the bridge approach in February. Bauer was 18. Freshly arrived and nervous in the way of all men who have just arrived at a front and have not yet learned that most fronts are, most of the time, profoundly dull. The mines on the approach? Bauer asked. Yes. The demolition charges under the supports? Wired and ready. Engineer officer checks them every Thursday. Ehrman leaned back in his chair. Bauer, this bridge has been in our hands since 1940. 4 years. Nothing has come across that canal that wasn't supposed to. The Allied landings are not tonight. Ehrman picked up his magazine. Even if they were tonight, and they are not, the nearest Allied unit is in England. Any airborne force drops miles away, assembles in the dark, marches to the objective. We would have an hour's warning at minimum. The phone lines to division are open. We are not alone here. Bauer looked at the darkness outside. The Norman fields were silent, the canal surface flat and black. You're certain, Bauer said. Ehrman looked at him over the magazine. I've been here 11 months, he said. Go and walk your post. Bauer went. Above the guardhouse at a height of 30 feet and descending, glider number 91 was moving at 60 miles per hour through total darkness, its wheels down, its approach angle 60 degrees. Jim Walwork counting backward from 35 in his head, with the precision of a man who has rehearsed this approach 17 times in a field in Wiltshire, and believes with every atom of professional faith he possesses in the timing matrix on the zero board in John Howard's pocket. Walwork was at 31. 30, 29, 28. Private Bauer heard nothing before the end, because there was nothing to hear. The Horsa glider was wood, and fabric, and gravity and silence, and it arrived at the east bank of the Caen Canal at precisely 0:16 hours and 21 seconds, and slid 68 meters through the wire and the earth before stopping 18 meters from the bridge approach. 47 yards, exactly, and then all 3 platoon commanders were blowing their whistles. Hit hard, hit first. Howard was out of the glider on the count of 2. He hit the ground, rolled, found his feet, took one bearing on the bridge tower that was now visible against the slightly lighter sky, and ran. His legs, the ground under them, the bridge. 30 meters, 20, he could hear the others, footfalls on turf, the particular urgent breathing of men running at absolute capacity, the jingle of equipment being held down. 10 meters, ahead on the bridge, a German sentry had heard something. He was turning. He was raising his weapon. He was beginning the motion of raising the alarm. Lieutenant Dennis Brotheridge was already past Howard and onto the bridge at a dead sprint, 31 meters per hour of righteous, terrified human momentum, and he threw the grenade at the second sentry position, and the detonation crashed across the canal, and the sentry dropped, and then the Sten gun opened up, and Brotheridge was still running, was still going, was leading them across, and it was working. It was working, the timing was right, the board was right, they were going to take the bridge. And then Dennis Brotheridge stopped running. He was at the far end of the bridge, 8 meters from the western parapet, and he stopped in the way that men stop when the message from the brain ceases to reach the legs. The Schmeisser burst had hit him high on the left feet side of the chest, and he went down sideways, and he did not get up. Howard reached him in 4 seconds. Here is what you need to understand about what John Howard did next. He did not stop for Dennis Brotheridge, not the way the word stop implies a pause, an evaluation, a choice. He dropped to his knees beside the man because stopping was not a decision. It was a reflex as automatic as breathing, the specific gravity of caring about a person pulling you down out of motion. Dennis Brotheridge was 28 years old. He was from Smethwick in the West Midlands, the son of a foundry worker. He had been in Howard's company for a year and a half and had the particular quality of competence that makes other people calmer simply by being present. He had a wife named Margaret at home. He had a daughter named Joy who was 2 weeks old and whom he had never held, because the operation orders had come through before he could get home on compassionate leave. And Margaret had named the girl Joy, because she was the joy of a terrible year, and Dennis had carried that name in his breast pocket written in Margaret's handwriting since the moment Howard had told him he could not go home. He had never held his daughter. Howard had his hand. Brotheridge's eyes were open and focusing with enormous effort. There was blood on the concrete of the bridge, black in the darkness spreading, and Howard had his hand in both of his, and Brotheridge was trying to speak. His lips were moving and no sound was coming, and Howard pressed his hand tighter and said, "I've got you, Den. I've got you." The lips moved again. A breath, Then, barely, in the voice of a man who has used up almost everything he has, did we get it? Howard looked up. Across the bridge, in the German position at the far end, Sergeant Thornton's platoon had cleared the second sentry post, and Private Parr, Tommy, who had been at 0 plus 40 seconds exactly at position 3 on the east parapet exactly as rehearsed, was at the gun position, and the shooting had stopped and somebody was blowing a green flare. "We got it, Den," Howard said. "We got the bridge." Brotheridge's hand went still. His chest moved once more, and then it did not move again, and John Howard held his hand until Corporal Bailey arrived and said, very quietly, "Sir, we need you." Howard laid Dennis Brotheridge's hand down on the concrete of the bridge he had just died taking, and he stood up, and he said nothing, and he went back to work. 18 minutes past midnight, the Bénouville Bridge was in Allied hands. The first Allied soldier killed in action on D-Day was lying on the western parapet of a bridge that no one in London or Washington would name for him. What he could not have known, what Howard did not learn until weeks later, was that on the far side of the bridge, in the demolished gun position, a crumpled piece of German engineers' paperwork had survived the action. It was a wiring schematic for the demolition charges under the bridge. The charges had been removed 3 days earlier, on Rommel's order, while the bridge was used as a supply crossing for the 21st Panzer Division. The charges had not been replaced. The bridge could not have been blown. The threat had been, at the moment of the assault, theoretical. Howard didn't know that. His men didn't know that. They had run onto that bridge believing the engineer would press the detonator in 11 seconds, and they had run because the timing matrix on a 4-penny piece of cardboard had told them they could get there in 11 seconds, and they had been right. That is the story. The charges were gone. But the principle was sound. The principle was what saved every man who crossed every other bridge in the war. At 1:30 hours on June 6th, Lord Lovat's commandos arrived at the bridge to the sound of Bill Millen playing the pipes, which was not in the operational plan, but was, by any measure, the correct thing to do. Brigadier Poet arrived at 7:15. He had landed by parachute 6 miles to the east and had walked and run and occasionally been carried across occupied France to reach the bridge that he had, 6 weeks previously, in a briefing room at Tarrant Rushton, told Major Howard was not going to be captured using a 47-yard tolerance standard encoded on a piece of cardboard. He found Howard at the bridge, standing by the eastern parapet with a mug of tea, supervising the removal of German equipment from the gun positions. Howard's leafied arm was in a makeshift sling, not from enemy action but from a jeep accident on the approach road where a vehicle had run a ditch in darkness and thrown him sideways. He was 48 hours into the most important operation of his career, and his arm was in a strip of uniform material. He had not mentioned this in any radio transmission. Poet stopped in front of him. He looked at the bridge. He looked at Howard. He looked at the eastern parapet, and the gun positions and the German bodies and the 24 men of D Company who were now holding what the entire German 21st Panzer Division had been unable to retake in 12 hours of counterattack. Then he said, "I was wrong about the board, sir," Howard said. "Not wrong about the unauthorized flights. Those were dangerous and irregular." Poet paused. "Wrong about the 47 yards. Wrong about the precision standard." He looked at the bridge again. "You were right." Howard said nothing. "Where is it?" Poet said, "The board." Howard reached into his leafied breast pocket with his good hand and took it out. 4 pence worth of cardboard covered in pencil marks, bent at one corner from being pressed against his sternum for the last 6 hours. Poet looked at it for a long time. Then he looked back up at the bridge. "I'd like to take it," he said. "For the record. For documentation." Howard looked at the board. He thought about the 14 unauthorized flights and the Wiltshire crash. And Tommy's voice in the dark saying, "I'm scared, sir. I just needed you to hear that I'm scared." And Denise Brotheridge's hand going still in his, and the first morning light now on the Caen Canal. He handed over the board. "There you are, sir," he said. He did not know then that the board would appear in no official documentation of the Bénouville Bridge operation. He did not know then that the Afeeder Action Report filed by 6th Airborne Division would describe the landing accuracy as exceptional, attributed to the skill of the glider pilots, with no mention of the timing methodology. He did not know then that Major General Richard Gale's report to the War Office, filed 2 weeks after D-Day, would credit the operation entirely to the courage and determination of the assault parties without reference to the precision standard that had made the courage and determination possible. He did not know any of this yet. He stood by the bridge that his men had taken with his arm in a sling and watched Brigadier Poet walk away with the cardboard. 4 pence worth of precision and unauthorized time that was about to become a footnote. Later that morning, the official reprimand arrived: the unauthorized use of training aircraft feet, the violation of official approach tolerance standards, the disregard for brigade orders, documented, filed, placed in his record. The DSO citation arrived the same week, an official reprimand and the Distinguished Service Order, 2 documents about the same man, and the same operation and the same piece of cardboard, filed by the same institution, processing a truth it could not quite contain. 6 weeks after D-Day, the American liaison document arrived at British 1st Airborne Corps headquarters. It was a tactical assessment of glider precision landing methodology, dated September 14, 1944, produced by the United States Army Air Forces Troop Carrier Command. It described, in considerable technical detail, a timing matrix approach to night glider assault that delivered landing accuracy of approximately 60 to 80 yards from target under operational conditions. The British field report documenting the 47-yard tolerance standard achieved at Bénouville was dated June 8, 1944. The Troop Carrier Command document appeared 98 days later. The Troop Carrier Command document did not cite the British original. It described the methodology as developed from American experience in Normandy and Sicily and recommended adoption across all Allied airborne divisions. The British report was in the filing system at Airborne Corps. The American report was in the planning documents for Operation Market Garden, which was approved 3 weeks later. Market Garden failed. The bridges were not taken in time. Howard was briefed on Market Garden from his hospital bed in England, where he was recovering from the jeep injury that had finally been properly assessed and found to include a fractured collarbone that had gone untreated for 9 weeks. Because he had not mentioned it. He listened to the briefing, and he asked one question: what was the glider tolerance standard? The staff officer answering the brief paused. 200 yards, sir. Standard doctrine. Howard said nothing. He was discharged from hospital in October 1944. He was not given another command. The war was, by then, a question of logistics rather than innovation, and John Howard's particular quality was not, in the institutional imagination of the British Army, a logistical one. He was a man who solved impossible problems with 4-penny cardboard in unauthorized night flights. The institution had been grateful for this quality at Bénouville. It did not have a role for it in the peace. He was demobilized in February 1946, age 33, with a DSO, a reprimand, and a collarbone that ached in cold weather. He went home to Oxford. Joy Howard was 27 years old and had been waiting for 2 years with the specific patience of a woman who has decided to treat every day that her husband does not come home as a deposit against the day he does. She was dark-haired and practical, with the dry observational humor of a person who has found that the truthful response to most situations is slightly funnier than the diplomatic one. She met him at the door in Oxford and looked at him for a moment, the DSO ribbon, the held posture, the collarbone, and said, "You didn't tell me about the arm. Didn't seem relevant. John, you had a broken collarbone for 9 weeks. There was a bridge to hold. There's always a bridge." She put her hand on his face. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, not the way the Army had looked at him, which was as an instrument with a specific capability, but as a person whose interior she had chosen to study. "Come in," she said. "I've kept your tea warm." They had 30 years together in Oxford. He worked at a printing firm, not the same one as his father, but close enough in spirit that on certain mornings he could smell the ink and feel the weight of a chair he had never sat in. He raised 2 children. He read widely and said little. He had nightmares about the bridge that he never described to anyone except Joy, who never asked for descriptions, which was the precise right thing to do. In 1962, Cornelius Ryan's book appeared, The Longest Day. It was a monumental account of D-Day, researched over 6 years, published to enormous international attention. It contained a chapter on the Bénouville Bridge operation. Howard read it in his armchair on a Thursday evening while Joy was in the kitchen. He read the chapter twice. Then he set the book on the side table and sat for a long time. His name was in it. That was not the problem. The operation was described correctly, broadly. The problem was the framing. The Bénouville operation was 3 pages in a book of 400 pages about D-Day. The precision landing standard, the 47 yards, the zero board, the unauthorized 14 flights, the specific methodology that had made the operation possible, was described in one sentence as the remarkable skill of the glider pilots. Jim Walwork was mentioned in passing as one of those pilots. The chapter did not mention fourpence. Howard sat for a long time. Joy came through from the kitchen, looked at the book on the side table, looked at Howard. She picked up the book. She read the chapter. She set it back on the table. "That is," she said, "the dumbest thing I have ever read. It's not inaccurate. It's not complete." "No," Howard said, "it isn't." Joy sat in the chair across from him. "Are you going to write to anyone?" Howard looked at the fire. "No." Joy looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You should write to Walwork." He hadn't spoken to Walwork since 1947. He wrote that night. The reply came 2 weeks later, 3 pages of Walwork's even handwriting. And it began, "I was waiting for you to say something. I've been waiting since 1944. Walwork had, it emerged, received a request from an American aviation journal in 1957 to describe the Bénouville approach as an example of U.S. Army Air Force's influence on Allied airborne doctrine. He had declined to respond. The article had appeared anyway, citing the approach profile as developed by American pilots in Sicily and refined at Normandy. The British field report was dated June 8, 1944. The American article cited materials from September 1944 onward. The Americans called it theirs. It was never theirs. In 1968, Howard received a letter. It was from Brigadier Nigel Poet, retired the previous year, writing from a house in Wiltshire. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, and it began, "Howard, I owe you something I should have said 24 years ago." Howard read it at the kitchen table. Joy was at the sink. He read all 4 pages without speaking. Poet wrote that he had spent years telling himself that his directive to abandon the 47-yard standard had been procedurally correct, which was true, and operationally irrelevant, which was also true, and that the success of the Bénouville operation had been despite his interference rather than because of his approval, which was the most honest sentence anyone senior to Howard had ever written about the operation. Poet had spent 24 years knowing this. He had spent the previous 4 writing the letter. He wrote, "I took the board from you at the bridge, and I filed it, and I cannot now find it in any archive I have contacted. I believe it was destroyed with other working documents after the Normandy campaign. I believe this was not accidental. I believe someone made a decision that the existence of an unauthorized timing standard that contradicted brigade directive was an inconvenience. I was not that person, but I was the person who made it possible for that person to act. I am sorry for that." He wrote, "The 47 yards was correct. It was always correct. You understood the mathematics before any of us. First and fast, I believe that was something your father used to say. I looked it up in a unit interview report from 1943 and found it there. It is the correct operational principle. I should have said so in 1944. Howard read the letter twice. Then he set it down. Joy turned from the sink. She looked at him. She could read his face after 30 years the way he could read a timing matrix, not the surface expression, but the mechanism underneath. "Is it good?" she asked. "It's honest," Howard said. 24 years late, but honest. "Right back," Joy said. She turned back to the sink. That was all she said. He wrote back. They corresponded until Poet's death in 1992. There is a document in the German Federal Military Archive in Freiburg, declassified in 1973, from General Major Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division in June 1944. It is a post-engagement analysis of the Bénouville bridge capture, written at the request of OKW in the weeks after. D-Day, Feuchtinger's division had been tasked with retaking the bridge within 4 hours of its capture. It had not done so. In the document, Feuchtinger writes, The precision of the landing was, by the assessment of our forward observers, something our defensive doctrine had not anticipated and could not effectively respond to. The standard assumption in defensive planning is that airborne forces require a dispersal, an assembly phase of 30 to 60 minutes minimum before effective action. The British unit at Bénouville had eliminated this phase entirely. They were on the objective before our sentries could respond. The method by which this was achieved, the specific approach geometry and timing, was not known to us and was not countered. I recommend its study. He could not understand what had happened. He could not understand a piece of cardboard had happened. He could not understand that fourpence and 14 unauthorized night flights and a compositor's son from Kennington who would not accept 200 yards when 47 was possible had happened. He recommended its study. The British Army at the institutional level did not study it, not formally, not with Howard's name attached. The principle, however, did not die. Here is what you need to understand about where fourpence went. The zero boards methodology, the precise timing matrix for rapid insertion of assault forces, the tolerance standard that forced pilots to work to approach geometry rather than approximately emanate aim, became, through unofficial transmission, through the memories of men who had been on the operation, and who became instructors and commanders, a foundational principle of what the British Army called precision coup de main operations. It reached the special operations community in the 1950s through the oral testimony of men who had flown in those 6 gliders. It was codified in the Joint Helicopter Support Unit's approach protocols in the 1960s, where it appeared under the heading Precision Insertion Without Attribution. It influenced the development of the Special Air Service's Close Target Reconnaissance methodology in the 1970s, the insistence on second-by-second assault timelines, the pre-planned approach geometry, the zero-friction rehearsal standard. In April 1980, the SAS assault on the Iranian embassy at Prince's Gate lasted 11 minutes and required zero-error timing coordination across 4 simultaneous entry points. The assault plan was drawn on paper. The tolerance standard was measured in seconds, not hundreds of yards. The methodology was not attributed to a major from Kennington in the briefing notes. But the principle was the same. The mechanism was identical. First and fast. Everything else follows. Fourpence, compounded across 36 years. John Howard died on May 5, 1999 at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, aged 86. Joy had died 3 years before him, and he had spent those 3 years with the particular quietness of a man who has had his interior companion for 52 years and does not quite know what to do with the silence. He did not complain about it. He had never complained about anything that cost him personally. He had kept her photograph on the mantelpiece the way the letter had asked. Tommy Parr was at the bedside. He was 74 years old and had retired from a 20-year career as a Royal Engineers instructor, had 3 grandchildren, and still carried in his breast pocket not the letter that Howard had written him the night before the operation, which he had returned on the morning of June 7th, as promised with a formality that had made Howard laugh for the first time in 24 hours. But a photograph taken at the Bénouville Bridge in 1984, at the 40th anniversary commemoration, which showed Howard and Walwork and himself standing at the eastern parapet, older, thicker, considerably less frightened, in front of the bridge that was now called Pegasus Bridge, and had been so since 1946. Tommy had given a eulogy at Joy's funeral. Howard had asked him to give one at his. Tommy stood at the lectern in the parish church in Kennington, Oxford, and looked at the people in the pews, and he said, "John Howard was the most frightened, brave man I ever knew. He was frightened of doing it wrong. He was frightened of the mathematics being incorrect. He was frightened of the 47 yards being impossible. He ran the extra flights because he was frightened of what happened if he didn't. He kept the board because he was frightened of a world in which the board was destroyed and men died at bridges because nobody had done the sums. That's what courage is. It isn't the absence of fear. It's being so afraid of the wrong outcome that you run toward the terrifying one instead." He paused. "He told me once, we were standing in a field in Wiltshire at midnight, and a glider had just fallen apart around us, he told me. The mathematics work. I was 19. I was absolutely certain we were going to die. And he said the mathematics work with the absolute calm of a man who has checked the numbers and is not afraid of numbers. That calm saved my life. Not just at the bridge. Every day for 50 years, when I've been frightened of something, I've thought, check the numbers. If the numbers work, go. Tommy folded his notes. He said that to me before D-Day. He'd gotten it from his father got it from a factory floor in Oxford. A man who'd been in the First War and come home and sat down at a kitchen table and fixed a broken clock in 35 seconds and said, "First and fast, son. First and fast. Everything else follows." He stepped back from the lectern. Outside, the May sun was on the Oxford streets, on the terraced houses of Kennington, on the Abingdon Road where the Holywell Press had stood, on the streets where Albert Howard had walked home from the print works smelling of ink. The Pegasus Bridge Museum stands today in Ranville, Normandy, beside the bridge that John Howard's men captured in 10 minutes on the first morning of D-Day. Inside the museum, in a glass case in the main hall, there is a reprimand notice and a DSO citation. They are displayed side by side, framed together as a single exhibit. The placard between them reads, "Both documents were processed by the same command structure in the same month concerning the same man and the same operation. There is no cardboard board. It was destroyed in the archival clear-out of 1945. Fourpence lost to a filing system that understood procedure and did not understand genius. The man who should have been named in the first line of every account of D-Day's opening action is named, in most American accounts of June 6, 1944, in a brief paragraph in the middle chapters. A feed are the long sections on Omaha Beach and Utah Beach and the heroism of the American airborne divisions. The chapter is usually correct. It is usually brief. It usually attributes the operation's success to courage and pilot skill. It does not mention fourpence. It does not mention a timing matrix or a precision standard or 14 unauthorized night flights or a company sergeant major standing at a jeep looking at the sky. The American film that defined a D-Day for a generation, The Longest Day, 1962, gave the Baynouville Bridge operation 7 minutes of screen time, less than a single company's assault on Omaha Beach received. The methodology was not depicted. The innovation was not depicted. The instrument, the board, the pencil, the fourpence was not depicted. You know why now. You know because I told you about Ida Parr and her factory hands in the 3 seconds she held Howard's hand on the pavement in Bermondsey. You know because I told you about Albert Howard and the broken clock and the 35 seconds and the 6 words that crossed 30 years to reach a bridge in France. You know because I told you about a piece of cardboard and a pencil and fourpence and what a man can do when he is more afraid of the wrong answer than he is of the right one being difficult. Remember the 6 words on a kitchen table in Kennington in 1930 from a quiet man who had survived the Somme by being first and fast? Remember the piece of cardboard that cost fourpence, drawn in pencil, kept inside a kit bag against the direct orders of a brigadier who knew better, carried in a breast pocket across the channel at 110 miles per hour in total Norman darkness. Remember 14 unauthorized flights in Wiltshire fields and a crashed glider and a 19-year-old from Bermondsey standing in the dark with shaking hands who chose to stay. Remember Dennis Brotheridge, 28 years old, from Smethwick, who had never held his daughter, who ran onto that bridge at the front because that was where the timing matrix said the front needed to be, and who was the first Allied soldier to die on D-Day, and who died asking if they'd got it. Remember they got it. Remember that 47 yards was impossible until it wasn't. Remember that 200 yards was the official standard, and the official standard was wrong, and that official standards written by men who have not done the mathematics are frequently wrong, and that the men who do the mathematics anyway, against orders at night, in broken gliders, on 4-penny cardboard, are the reason we are here. Remember the brigadier's letter, 4 pages and 24 years late, that began, "I owe you something I should have said in 1944. Remember the German general's report, sitting in Freiburg, recommending study of something he could not identify or name, a piece of cardboard, and a man who refused to accept that 200 yards was good enough. Remember that the Americans called it theirs. It was never theirs. Remember that it was British. That it was built in the nights and fields of Wiltshire by a compositor's son who learned about timing from a broken clock and a dead father's 6 words. That it was flown by a Manchester man who trusted a number someone else worked out, that it was tested by a 19-year-old who was frightened and said so, and went anyway. Remember that the bridge still stands. That Joy Brotheridge visited it every year until she was too old to travel. That the Café Gondry by the canal was the first house liberated in France, and its owner opened a bottle of champagne he had buried in the garden in 1940. That Bill Millen played the pipes at 1:30 in the morning, and nobody told him to stop, because in that particular moment the rules had been suspended in favor of something more important. Remember that if you have ever heard the name Pegasus Bridge, if you have ever seen the photograph of the 6 gliders in the grass, or the plaque on the eastern parapet, or the display case with the 2 documents side by side, you are looking at the work of a man who solved an impossible problem with 4 pence worth of cardboard and the absolute faith in mathematics that his father taught him at a kitchen table in Oxford. 90 years ago, the mathematics worked, first and fast. Everything else follows. If you know someone who served in the airborne forces or who knows this story from a grandfather's telling, leave their name below. These stories were buried once. We are not going to bury them again. Subscribe if you want to hear more of them, more of the men the histories forgot, more of the 4-penny solutions to the problems that were killing people, while the official channels moved at the pace of bureaucracy. There are more of them than you think, and they deserve to be remembered.